Consoles that aren't affordable to collect for. That's kind of a bummer. I remember when some of these consoles were brand new, and if you wanted a game for them then, you could just wait a while and eventually the price of the game would go down. Well, whoops-a-daisy, we waited 20 years too long. That's unfortunate, but which consoles exactly are we talking about being unaffordable? Okay, I'm not seeing a lot of wiggle room here. Also, what does unaffordable even mean? It could mean something different for each person, but for the sake of this video, let's just say it's when the price of a game is higher than most people care to spend on it. A description that could certainly apply to a lot of games. Of course, just because we call something unaffordable doesn't mean we won't spend money on it. We love video games, and for some people, what we really can't afford is to not have some of these games in our lives. Something that I've noticed people really like to say when it comes to games having gone up in price are things like, I sure am glad I bought this game years ago when it was much cheaper. Yeah, we're all very happy for you, with perhaps some people less happy than others, but that doesn't help the people who are trying to buy the game now. Remember, as much as it might seem like it at times, not everybody tried to collect everything they wanted right when they started. Some people are finally getting around to certain games. Plus, not everyone started collecting years ago. It's a popular hobby that people are constantly getting into. And if you're like me, wanting the younger folks to care about these older games so that gaming's legacy can live on, then what's their excuse? Yeah, you should have bought this game when you were still a fetus. Get your act together, bozo. Okay, so I'd say we could use some optimism right about now. So here's where I'll point out that luckily, there are still ways to play most of these games, even if you don't want to collect them. And even if you still want to play on the original hardware as well. Yeah, it may not exactly scratch that collecting itch, but there's always something else that can. Check this out. I never miss a chance to let you all ooh and ah over my bread bag clip collection. What can I say? I'm a connoisseur. But when it comes to game consoles you can name your price for, surprisingly the Sega Saturn has its bases covered. One of the primary candidates when it comes to unaffordable consoles. With a little know-how, there's ways to play games on the Saturn without actually using the original discs. Might sound like a hassle, but after you look at the prices of Saturn games, it may not seem like such a hassle anymore. Although, let me be clear, that's more so just a workaround than an argument for the Saturn being affordable. I just feel it's important that we establish the context that collecting original copies isn't the only way to play these games. In most cases, collecting original copies is just the only way to collect original copies. What's unfortunate about the Saturn is that it really could have benefited from being more popular back in the day. If only Segata Sanshiro, part of Japan's marketing campaign, had come to other parts of the world to carry out his mission of beating up kids until they bought a Saturn. Yeah, it's a little aggressive, but I'd still say it falls into get on my lawn territory. The Saturn also highlights another one of the big reasons why consoles are often unaffordable. Everybody more or less wants the same games. Why? Well, because those are the best games for the console, that's why. If your idea of the dream team for Saturn is Striker 96, Blackfire, and Quarterback Club, good news, the Saturn just became much more affordable. Although, funny enough, even the games people would call the bottom feeders of the Saturn's library will still cost you something, and I've got a sneaking suspicion as to why. It's these dang fragile cases. Sure, there's been options to purchase brand new aftermarket ones, but people go after the original games for their cases. Heck, I'd say for some games the case they're in is more valuable than the game itself. And from my experience, it's hard to find cases without at least some sort of damage, which, yeah, I know they're fragile, but was it really that hard for people to have taken better care of them? But hey, why do this with your games when you can do this instead? One last thing I'd like to mention for Saturn games is that the whole should have bought it back in the day when it was easier wasn't always as straightforward as it was for other consoles. Because the Saturn wasn't super popular back then, say for Japan, finding some games even at release could prove to be challenging. And not because the games were sold out due to overwhelming demand, oh no. Sometimes somebody's closest game store wasn't even carrying a single copy of that game. When some games are released nowadays, they're using half the copies as toilet paper, they have so many of them. You'll hear stories for some of the more rare games where people literally had to drive to a different town just to find a store that even had a copy of the game. And speaking of games that have pretty much always been a hassle to buy, let's talk about the Neo Geo. Some of the prices for Neo Geo games now almost seem like a joke you can't believe. But you might be thinking, wait, was the Neo Geo ever affordable? Well, relative to the price it was released for, I'd say there were some small pockets of opportunity to collect for it much cheaper, and especially depending what exactly you were trying to collect. But for the most part, yeah, it was expensive then and expensive now, with very limited windows of opportunity to get the games for cheap. What's kind of unique about the Neo Geo is that the product that was released to the public back in the day, called the AES, is usually way harder to track down games for than the actual arcade cartridges used in arcade cabinets back in the day, which you're looking at right here. And no, these aren't oversized VHS tapes. They were supposed to just be for arcades, which were pretty widespread back in the day, but once most arcades bit the dust, these cartridges would find their way into new hands. But whose hands? The hands of grifters, drifters, and thrifters? Nah, I'd say for the most part they ended up in the hands of people who love the Neo Geo. You rarely see Neo Geo games being sold by anybody other than somebody who knows exactly what they have, and often fans of the Neo Geo themselves. For a long time, MVS games were relatively affordable compared to AES cartridges, but once the word got out and demand made its way to that spectrum, yeah, the prices started going up on those as well. In my opinion though, what really creates a barrier to entry for collecting for the Neo Geo is that the hardware itself is expensive, especially compared to other consoles. I mean, you can say that the price of a game like Xenogears sucks, but at least you can get a PS1 console for a relatively small chunk of change. But with the Neo Geo, you're looking at original arcade hardware that was expensive to begin with, and that hasn't changed with time. Luckily, there's a ton of different ways to play Neo Geo games without original hardware. And heck, some people who even do have original hardware just get one of these multi-carts and say, screw it, I'm done. Okay, but now let's talk about some consoles where there were definitely opportunities to get the games for cheaper. Assuming you'd already been born at the time, don't forget the young people, Nintendo consoles, and specifically the Super Nintendo and GameCube. That's right, if there's one thing collectors should have learned by now, it's that consoles designed with purple become collectible. For Super Nintendo, there was a long period of time where you could get the games for cheap in the years shortly after its lifespan. This is when playing older games wasn't nearly as popular as it is now, and most people weren't thinking about the possibility of them becoming desirable down the road. It wasn't considered cool old stuff, it was just considered old, the type of distinction I'm prepared to battle myself later on in life once I'm a geezer. So you tend to hear lots of stories from the late 90s, early 2000s, heck even more recent than that, about people finding games for next to nothing. But again, these stories of people's former glories don't do us much good now, do they? What's kind of a bummer in my mind is that it actually looked like Super Nintendo prices were going down a bit at one point, right after the Super Nintendo Classic came out. Pretty straightforward theory behind that one. People felt like that mini console gave them enough of a Super Nintendo experience, and perhaps that life seemed simpler with just this instead. Some people might argue against that, saying that it just brought more attention to the console and increased the demand for people wanting to collect the original games, to which I'd say, sure, that's a possibility. Meanwhile, the GameCube is your classic loser redemption story. Not liked as much back then, much more popular now. I almost don't feel bad that the prices got high on this one. I mean, yeah, ultimately I do wish the prices were lower, but a part of me thinks, hey, nobody listened to me back in the day when I tried to say it's a good console. And by nobody listened to me, I mean the two people that I tried to persuade. Hey, I did my part. While most of the consoles that aren't affordable these days are often consoles that didn't have much exposure at the time of release, People certainly knew what the GameCube was, they just ignored it, kind of like what happened to me in high school. But whatever the reason is for a console no longer being affordable, or perhaps that never were, the fact remains we sure wish it was more affordable now. A lot of them are consoles people didn't give much of a chance back when they were current. Yeah, if you're trying to collect for anything even remotely obscure, it's probably pricey. But if you'll allow me to try for some positivity, sometimes when something isn't affordable, it can provide clarity. For years I debated whether or not I wanted Little Samson, now I don't. It's out of reach, and in a way it's kind of nice to just not worry about it. You think I've ever stressed over buying a magnetic floating bed? I mean, at least I can always play Little Samson if I want to. Somebody left a comment on one of my videos recently that I thought was some great advice. Whenever a game's price is bumming you out, look for an alternative game that is sort of similar but far cheaper. May not always be a possibility, but a lot of times it is. There are a lot of games out there, and sometimes by similar, I mean the exact same game. I was looking to get Time Splitters 2 and realized the Xbox version is much cheaper than the GameCube version people like to go after, and I think the controller is better for it anyways. But with that said, and for the sake of trying to put a positive spin on kind of a negative topic, for this video's question, I want to ask you to list a game where the price was out of reach, but you still managed to come up with a happy solution, regardless of what that might have been. So for that and anything else you may want to say, leave a comment and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games.